Korea Bond.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First and my colleague Barbara Stewart to speak on the first reading of the Health Fluoridation of Drinking Water Amendment Bill 2016. So, Mr Speaker, the current position of councils is that the local authorities fund drinking water supplies from rates and they are responsible for the decisions on fluoridation. I just want to kind of cut to the chase, Mr Speaker, and upfront say that New Zealand First will be opposing this bill. I'm not here, and neither is New Zealand First, here to debate whether we fluoridate or whether we don't in our communities. We are leaving that up to the communities themselves to decide that. What we are here today in the House to do is talk about the amendment of this bill, and where it amends Part 2A of the Health Act 1956. And the other provisions of the amendments too, Mr Speaker, is the fact that there is a two offence provisions should the a water supplier actually breach these provisions. And also to the fact, Mr Chair, is that this bill will actually need to look at in detail the ongoing consequential issues, because we're going to have to look at amending the New Zealand Public Health Act 2000 as well, Mr Speaker. So the reason why we are opposing this bill is because primarily locals know what locals need best. Fundamentally, this bill is shifting the change of decision making from local councils over to DHBs, and I don't think that this has been addressed in the House enough so far by previous members, and I want to discuss the fact that this provision of movement of powers from local councils to DHBs, we need to look at the fact and consider the fact that over all of our DHBs currently in New Zealand, they are actually sitting there $65.5 million in the red. $65.5 million in total deficit for DHBs around this country. And New Zealand First does actually wonder and actually stresses too about further burdening our DHBs by having this provision of decision-making moved from local councils over to DHBs. Now, New Zealand First does believe this is a contentious issue and that the final decision should be made up by the people of New Zealand by having a referendum, and primarily too because consumers have the democratic right to decide what is in their drinking water by referendum, and it's actually up to local councils to enact those changes. We've already seen around the country a number of local councils take this into the issues of holding a referendum, and I can see, Mr Speaker, that from Thames, Coromandel, Hamilton, Hastings and actually Whakatane, that they've actually made movements to do this. However, with the Whakatane Council, the council went against what the referendum actually preferred, Mr Speaker. So in reality, with the shifting of the responsibility from local councils over to our DHBs to manage this, New Zealand First believes unequivocally that locals should actually get to decide, that there should be a local referendum held, and that that referendum be binding, Mr Speaker. We believe that it is a continued theme from this government to remove the democratic right of locals to choose for themselves. And this bill, although I understand the intentions are actually good and it is about oral health care, it still doesn't remove the fact that there's a familiar pattern of removing local rights of locals to have a referendum and decide for themselves what is their position for their community. So I want to also add to the fact, Mr Speaker, that what I did think about when I was reading through this bill was the fact that this bill provides two offence provisions. And the Minister himself answered a question that I was going to ask, and that is, what if they are a private water supplier to the council? How do they fit underneath this provision? And the Minister answered the question so eloquently, which basically said all private water suppliers that are used by the council are actually government-owned. So what we need to look at is the fact that, well, this is an issue. If they commit an offence, and one of the offences actually is a maximum of up to $200,000, if a private provider actually commits an offence, then they actually get away with it scot-free. because apparently this area is outside of the scope of the bill. Now, they commit an offence, they get away with it scot-free, and don't have to pay up to the maximum penalty of $200,000, but for every other offence after that initial act, there's a $10,000 offence penalty to those breaches. So these private water suppliers are absolutely getting away with not having to worry about being penalised, not having to worry about committing an offence, and there's no responsibility for that side of the suppliers back to this government, back to our ratepayers. And that is a huge concern, Mr. Speaker. I also looked at the fact that what is this bill really telling us? And I've come to the assumption, Mr. Speaker, from taking a little bit from other speakers in the House today, that really the government does want compulsory fluoridation and is simply hiding behind their DHBs to actually enforce it. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, the government need to be upfront and actually take responsibility for compulsory fluoridation themselves. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, we do look at the fact and know that the Ministry of Health do currently hold all of the scientific evidence on the fluoridation of drinking water, and that's fine. That's fine that they've got that. The issue here is why then is the actual Ministry of Health not providing the information to local councils? I mean, what is so hard about the left hand talking to the right hand in this instance, Mr. Speaker? So that's clearly an issue there, and I think that the Ministry of Health, they should be required to actually give local councils and the public all of this information on fluoridation in their area to allow the people to make their own informed decisions via referendum. So, Mr. Speaker, as I said at the start, I'm going to cut to the chase and say that New Zealand First are absolutely opposing this bill because it takes away the decision-making process from locals to decide for what's best for locals in terms of who holds the provision of powers to actually be the overarching decision makers on whether to fluoridate or not, and I do think, Mr. Speaker, that yes, this bill actually and the issue is a hot potato, and by simply being passed from one buck to the next is simply not good enough, Mr. Speaker. And we do think that the public does need to be fully informed, and we do think that the public have a right to take this into consideration, and each area should actually be holding a referendum and make it binding, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.